Hello, and welcome to MRA's 5-Minute HR Feed, the podcast where we share quick and practical information. In the time it takes you to go grab a cup of coffee, you'll gain insights into hot topics and pressing HR issues. I'm your host, Nicole Morehouse, and we're glad you're listening. Before we start, here's our usual disclaimer that the information being shared is not and should not be considered legal advice. Now let's dive into our topic.
Today, I'm going to be talking about a common question that we receive on the hotline. So picture a scenario. You're an employer, you work in HR, and one of the employees comes into your office with their resignation. Sometimes you know that this is terrible news and this is going to have a negative impact on your organization. Sometimes it might be great news, either for personal circumstances specific to that employee or for business reasons. You want to take advantage of the notice and not necessarily have the employee work out that notice. There are several things that you need to think about, and I'm going to talk about those things at a high level. Before you cut a notice short, think of these things. First, are you an at-will employer? If so, the employment relationship generally can be terminated at any time by either party. But if the employment relationship is not at will and there's any contractual component, you may need to seek counsel to make sure that you don't breach any of those contractual requirements. Next, do you have a company policy? Have you established a precedent or past practice that, for consistency purposes, would be dangerous to deviate from? Check your company policy, check past practice, find out what others have done in the past in these sort of situations. Oftentimes, separation, resignation, termination policies ask for a specific amount of notice as a contingency for specific benefits and trade. So, for example, we commonly see employers ask for a 2-week notice in order for the employee to be paid out any unused accrued vacation. Make sure these contingencies are legal. Make sure they're permitted by municipal, county, state, and federal laws. If you don't have a policy, are you consistent with, if you do have a policy, you need to be consistent, but if you don't have a policy, do you have past practice? Have you set a precedent, and are you consistent with those practices? It's important to take an inventory before cutting a resignation notice period short, as the possibility of a claim will increase in these cases. Separation, resignation, and termination policies should also include language to confirm that the company will, in some cases, shorten or forego notice when it's mutually beneficial for business necessity. You need to consider whether or not your policy or your past practice or precedent has offered pay in lieu of notice. If pay in lieu of notice is not provided, shortening the notice will be considered generally as an involuntary separation of employment because the employer is deciding when employment ends, not the employee. Therefore, think about that further, that might qualify the person for unemployment benefits. Another consideration that you need to make is the amount of notice that is provided. Fortunately, we have some great employees out there that will give us ample notice that they're leaving their position with us. And so that advance notice is often very, very beneficial. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the notice period, right? So referring back to your policy, always a good idea to have a policy. So some employees will provide more notice than is expected or stated in the company policy. Ensure that policy covers these situations, referencing which of the days and or weeks expected for notice will be considered the notice period for the purposes of meeting any of those benefit contingencies like vacation payout that I mentioned earlier. Also consider payment of any wages. So in most jurisdictions, if an employee is not working, they're not required to be paid, right? They're not performing work. So very clear for non-exempt employees, hourly employees, non-exempt employees under the FLSA, payment is only required for hours worked. For exempt employees, in the last week of employment, that is one of the few exceptions when you can deduct from their regular weekly salary. So there is the ability to cut that time short, but even if it is not required, an employer may decide to compensate the employee for their notice period, like we talked about earlier with pay in lieu of notice. Make sure, again, you are checking if you're complying with all of the legal requirements in terms of municipal, county, state, and federal laws where the employee works before determining if you're going to compensate or not compensate during the notice period. Lastly, and not to be understated, is the impression this is going to have on your workforce. If an employer starts to decline notice periods, cut them short, any of your existing workforce is going to see that as problematic, right? So they are going to see that as the employer not making good on their end of a policy or past practice. So if you want the employee to give 2 weeks notice and then you cut that week notice short, you're not living up to your end of the bargain in terms of being able to mutually part ways over that notice period. Employees may choose to forego providing notice in those cases to ensure that they're going to be paid until the last day that they want to work. And so you may see a decline in the notice period being fulfilled or given. Treating employees who are exiting from the organization in a respectful manner may help to reduce the risk of complaints or claims filed against the employer. And it also obviously will help create a more favorable reputation. With that said, we know that there are very unique circumstances where an employer, out of business necessity or very individual circumstances with that particular employee, do want to consider cutting the notice period short. That's why we thought we would provide this guidance to you today. Hopefully this episode has been helpful for you. We look forward to you joining us on future episodes. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to MRA's 5-Minute HR Feed. Be sure to follow and connect with us for more podcasts and updates. If you're a member and have questions, you can always connect with MRA's 24/7 HR hotline by emailing infonow@mranet.org or by calling 866-474-6854.